Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Don Hubin. I'm the director of the OSU Center for Ethics and Human Values. Thank you for coming this afternoon, and I hope you came for the event and not for the air conditioning. First, I want to begin by thanking some people without whose hard work this would not have been possible, in particular Steve Brown, the Associate Director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, and Lavender McKittrick-Schweitzer and Ali Massoff, who you probably saw as you were coming in here. Let me tell you a little bit about the program today. After today's talk, I will rejoin our speaker on the stage for a question and answer period, but the questions won't be mine, they will be yours. You can submit a question at any time that you want to by going to the web address that's up at the top of the slide there, go.osu.edu/ask. It'll be up there for all of the slides. Good. And you'll be able to see other questions that others have submitted, and you can upvote them, or if you're feeling particularly negative, I guess you can downvote them. We will take that as an indication of what questions people want to have asked. Our speaker today is Professor Elizabeth Anderson. She majored in philosophy and minored in economics at Swarthmore College and earned her doctorate in philosophy at Harvard University. After earning her PhD, her career took a distinct downward turn when she accepted a position at a university up in Ann Arbor. But she has flourished there, and she now holds 3 named professorships, the Arthur F. Thurnau Professorship, the John Rawls Collegiate Professorship of Philosophy and Women's Studies, the John Dewey Distinguished University Professorship of Philosophy and Women's Studies, and I think her business card must be a multi-paged business card. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she has designed and was the first director of the University of Michigan's program in philosophy, politics, and economics. And OSU has taken some inspiration, not from the university up north, but from Professor Anderson, and created its own program in philosophy, politics, and economics through the hard work of 2 of my colleagues, Eric McGilvery in the Department of Political Science, who is sitting right back there, and Piers Turner in the Department of Philosophy, sitting right next to him. And if you're interested in the PPE program, there is a flyer on the PPO program right outside the door. You can grab that on your way out. If I were to go through Professor Anderson's awards and honors, we wouldn't have time for the talk. I think that would be a bad time budgeting problem there. So I'm not going to say more about that, but let me say just a little bit about her work. Professor Anderson has devoted her career to addressing the sort of small and easily answered questions in philosophy, like what is justice, what is value, what are the different kinds of value, and what's the nature and limits of liberty. Her focus on these grand and time-honored questions in philosophy hasn't led her to neglect some of the more pressing and immediate problems that philosophers have historically paid too little attention to, issues of race and gender and their intersection with considerations of justice, the ethical limitations of markets, affirmative action, social epistemology, etc. Professor Anderson's talk this afternoon, is titled The Great Reversal, How Neoliberalism Turned the Economic Aspirations of Liberalism Upside Down. We will learn how some ideals, some principles that were designed to support the interests of workers are invoked to impede their interests. And I will say, based on an opportunity to have had a quick look at some of her slides, that if you're interested in these questions, I think you're in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming Professor Anderson.
It's a tremendous pleasure to come to Ohio State's steamy campus and to address you today. One of the themes of my work is to consider the historical legacies of major ideas and how they're reflected in contemporary practices in such a way as to enable us to critically reflect on where we are today. So I'm going to start off just by showing you where we are today in economic terms. Here you can see some recent economic history. You can see that from about 1950 to 1970, the typical American's wages kept up with productivity growth. Then we see a major inflection point around 1974 or so, after which hourly compensation of workers pretty much stagnates, even as productivity continues to rise. That wage gap there between productivity and hourly compensation is largely taken up by the increasing share of capital in the distribution of income, and to a certain extent also the increasing share of the top 1% of salaried workers. This is not a phenomenon unique to the United States. So here we can see the labor share of income in advanced economies. So these would include the economies of the European Union, as well as Japan, South Korea, and so forth. And you can see that it also, across the rich countries of the world, has been in decline. What has caused this decline of the labor share of income and the increase in capital share of income, the share of income that is received through things like profit, rent, and interest? There are a large number of public policy changes. Here I'm focusing on the US case. Many of these changes have happened abroad as well, so I'll touch a little bit on the European Union. It's changes in policy, in laws, that have driven this change in the distribution of income between capital and labor. One thing that has happened is a worldwide increase in protections for intellectual property, patents and copyrights. This is largely driven recently in the past few decades through trade agreements. The graph shows you the historic increase under US law just in the duration of copyright, and you can see that it has steadily increased practically from the founding of this country. Global trade agreements, though, have extended the reach of American copyright law across the world. Here's a second development that focuses more on the United States. The doctrinal basis of antitrust law has dramatically limited the scope for the enforcement of antitrust. This also happened after the 1970s. The premier innovator of antitrust law is Judge Robert Bork, most famously known for being denied a seat on the Supreme Court. But in fact, his greatest influence was he created a revolution in antitrust law, which made it almost impossible to enforce. One of the results of this is that you can see, especially in America's rural areas, increasing concentration of employers. And a result of this is that workers who are skilled in a particular sector have fewer and fewer companies that are competing for their labor, and hence they're facing more of a monopsony situation. And we know that under conditions of monopsony, the seller is at a disadvantage, in this case, the seller of labor, and so wages have gone down. Another trend, not just in America, but in Britain and even to a large extent in Europe, the rest of Europe, is the financialization of the economy due to the deregulation of banking, finance, currency, and so forth. And you can see before the great financial crash, many countries around the world saw a larger and larger share of their economic activity devoted to finance. The financialization of the economy also increased capital share of income. This also had further effects As you know, in 2008, there was a financial crisis which led the central bank of the rich countries, the central banks of the rich countries around the world, to bail out the banks and leave the borrowers bankrupt. So debtors didn't get a break from the bailouts, but the banks did. We see both in the United States and in Europe a tightening of bankruptcy laws, again, making it very difficult for creditors, for debtors to discharge their debts and giving an upper hand to creditors. In the Eurozone, this has pressed especially heavily on countries such as Greece that are deeply in debt and put them into a long-term recession. International trade deals have also largely benefited capital at the expense of labor. One reason for this is that capital has become extremely mobile across international borders. Labor inherently is less mobile, even within the European Union, where workers have a formal right to move. There are just practical obstacles to effective movement. For instance, mastery of the foreign language of the country where one wants to seek work, and also ties to one's own community. Capital is always more mobile than labor under a free movement regime. And so that leaves workers stuck in places that maybe capital has abandoned. And so you see concentrated unemployment in areas that have been stricken by international trade, where their local companies have not been able to withstand the competition. In the United States, we also see declining enforcement of labor law, and hence a steadily declining share of workers that are represented by a labor union. That has also served to depress wages. It's also the case that since about 1980, taxes on capital income have dramatically declined, whereas taxes on ordinary workers' income has actually increased. So after-tax take-home income has shifted dramatically against workers and in favor of capital owners. Finally, and this by no means exhausts all of the policy changes that have led to an increasing capital share of income, but I just want to throw in this last one. The movement towards privatizing and outsourcing public services to private for-profit corporations also typically leads to a decline in the share of wages and an increase in the compensation of the top executives of the private for-profit firms, and of course a share of income that now goes to capital owners, which before wouldn't have gone to capital owners at all when it was run by government, which is a nonprofit organization. So now we have to ask why, what can justify these shifts? What has been used to justify this rather dramatic shift in labor's share of income, which has led to a widespread stagnation of incomes for most people in the United States? You might have just heard a headline that came out a couple of days ago where finally there's a peak, a new maximum in median household income. You might have seen that. The median, that would be half of American households make more and half make less. It's about $61,000 now per year. But that $61,000 peak is only slightly better than the median income adjusted for inflation of households, US households in 1999. So we've been stagnant for about 20 years. What could justify this? Well, what has been used to justify this shift is what we roughly call neoliberalism. That's a kind of ambiguous phrase. I'm using it simply to denote a whole package of policies that have had a general tendency to shift the distribution of income from labor to capital. Neoliberalism claims to be a restoration of so-called classical liberalism. So ideologically, we see a set of concepts, ideals, and norms that are invoked from the tradition of classical liberalism that are supposed to be justifying the package of neoliberal policies that have had these distributive outcomes. So this includes, for instance, the idea of free markets, leading to massive deregulation of markets, increasing international trade deals, a stress on property rights, which has been used to strengthen international protection of intellectual property laws, freedom of contract, which is used to justify more stringent enforcement of credit contracts against debtors, the idea of efficiency, which has been invoked to justify the privatization of public functions and their outsourcing to for-profit corporations. The need for incentives, which is used to justify stronger protections of intellectual property, reduced taxes on capital, higher executive compensation. And finally, the idea of shareholder capitalism, the idea that the fundamental obligation of for-profit corporations is to maximize profits. So now, since neoliberalism claims to be restoring the original ideals of classical liberalism, I, as a political philosopher, am very interested in investigating whether that is an accurate representation, whether neoliberalism really does restore the original ideals of classical liberalism. Well, what was classical liberalism? Here I'm going to define it by figures who are unquestionably classical liberals, okay? And then we'll see what they said. So who are people who are unquestionably, that is, all sides agree that these figures are classical liberals? Well, I think it's quite clear. John Locke, on the upper left there, Adam Smith, unquestionably classical liberals. The Marquis de Condorcet in France, unquestionably a classical liberal. We could add, as a late representative of classical liberalism, John Stuart Mill in the 19th century. I think he's coming at the end of classical liberalism, but he's still widely regarded as a classical liberal. And then I want to throw in two American favorites. Usually when we look at the canon of political philosophy, we tend to ignore the contributions of Americans. I think they're really important and interesting figures, so I'm going to throw in two of my favorites. Thomas Paine, who participated in both the American and the French revolutions, and Abe Lincoln, who deserves serious reading as a very serious political thinker. So let's see, is it the case that these classical liberals favored the interests of capital owners over workers? That is the question, because if they didn't, then it would be highly problematic to claim that neoliberal policies are restoring the founding ideals of classical liberalism. So I don't want to turn this into a pop quiz at all. I'm going to give you the answers, but if you know the answer, please shout it out. Who said, God gave the world in common to the use of the industrious, and labor was to be his title to it? The same person said, as justice gives every man a title to the product of his honest industry, so charity gives every man a title to so much out of another's plenty as will keep him from extreme want. To call something a title is to call it a property right. And this figure is claiming that the private property that we acquire through our own labor is exactly on a par with a poor person's entitlement to claim income from a wealthy person if their extreme wants require it. Any thoughts? Locke, very good. Good old Locke, okay? Who said this? The property which every man has in his own labor, as it is the original foundation of all other property, so it is the most sacred and inviolable. This person also said, when state regulation is in favor of the workman, it is always just and equitable. Always. Smith, very good, yes, that's good, Adam Smith, yes, okay. This one's a little bit harder. Labor is prior to and independent of capital. In fact, capital is the fruit of labor and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Hence, labor is the superior, greatly the superior of capital. Oh, wow, you're really great. I thought people would say Marx, right? But no, this is indeed Lincoln. This is his stump speech for the 1860 presidential election. I strongly recommend that you read it. The best version of it is in his address before the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society. He gave a different version before the joint sessions of Congress, but they both basically said the same thing. So let's reflect on these classical liberals, okay? The first thing to understand about them is that before they could establish a foundation of property rights in labor, they first had to assault existing property rights. It's a very deep theme of these classical liberals. Just because property rights exist in law doesn't mean that they're justified. So in fact, we see consistently in the classical liberals a theme of anti-monopoly. Get rid of those chartered monopolies, okay? The state has no business setting up a monopolist. Maybe we should ask some questions about the duration of intellectual property rights. They attacked inheritance laws as they existed in England at the time. Adam Smith argued that primogeniture and entail, the system of inheritance laws that kept the market in land locked up in the possession of a few hundred aristocratic families, was profoundly unjust. Tom Paine famously argued for an estate tax, inheritance taxes, which he argued ought to be used to fund a comprehensive scheme of social insurance, including old age pensions and disability, compensation for disability. They all articulated anti-slavery principles. Very important. Abolition of slavery was a major issue in those days. These classical liberals also explicitly defended the rights of workers. They opposed all forms of unfree labor, not just slavery, but serfdom, peonage, indentured servitude, apprenticeship, unpaid apprenticeship. Many of you probably are desperately looking for an unpaid apprenticeship. Read Adam Smith. He thought this was outrageously unjust. You ought to be paid. Your work is valuable. They agreed that legitimate property rights have to be founded on labor, on working for it. In contrast with capital income, which you get just for owning stuff, not for lifting a finger. Locke and Smith both agreed on the labor theory of value, the idea that it's labor that is the fundamental source of value, of added value in the world. Locke, famously in the Second Treatise of Government, asserted a 99% labor theory of value. The value of unimproved land was worth only 1%, and the value of the labor mixed into it is 99% of GDP. Locke certainly understood that workers were not getting 99% share of GDP. There's an injustice there, I think he's implying. Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, famously argued for high and increasing wages. He excoriated capital owners for complaining about how lazy the workers are. His argument was, you're not paying them enough, right? If you pay them, they'll be working plenty hard. Lincoln, Paine, and John Stuart Mill all advocated an ideal of universal self-employment. Why should workers have bosses at all? They should all be running their own little enterprises. For Lincoln and Paine, they were imagining individual self-employment. Consider the yeoman farmer or the individual craftsman who owns his own shop. By the time we get to John Stuart Mill after the Industrial Revolution, Mill argued that the destiny of workers was lodged in worker cooperatives, worker-owned firms, where they would all be equals in running the firm. Here again, lovely quote. Free labor argues that as the author of Man makes every individual with one head and one pair of hands, it was probably intended that that particular head should direct and control that particular pair of hands. Beautiful line from Lincoln's stump speech, okay? He's saying, what do we have bosses for, right? Everyone should be a self-directed worker. That was his ideal. Condorcet and Paine jointly invented the idea of social insurance for workers on the argument that workers too need their own form of income that's not derived from labor. Social insurance is a way, in a sense, the workers substitute for a lack of capital ownership. Everybody needs, at some point in their lives, a source of income not derived from their own labor because they're ill, too young, too old to work. Where's that income going to come from? Well, the rich, they have land, they have capital of some sort. Workers need that too, and social insurance performs that function. What happened to this classical liberal vision? What happened was the Industrial Revolution. This put an end to the aspiration of individual workers to be self-employed. The typical artisan got wiped out by large-scale manufacturing firms. Economies of scale simply overwhelmed the small artisan producer. And such people were then reduced to wage laborers. My argument is that by the time we get to the late 18th and into the 19th century, many of those classical liberal ideas that were originally advanced in favor of the workers got inverted. Okay? And there are several causes of this, and I'm going to then now give you a very big picture of how classical liberalism turned into neoliberalism in the 19th century. We had an interlude of what we could broadly call social democracy, and then since the mid-1970s, a reversion not to classical liberalism, but to the 19th century inversion. That's the very, very big picture. But now we're going to focus on what happened in the 19th century as people are responding to the Industrial Revolution. The first thing that happened was a split between capital and labor. The classical liberals imagined, they hoped for a system in which workers would own their own capital in one form or other and work their own capital. But the rise of huge-scale factories made that aspiration impossible. Workers couldn't gather up enough savings to build a giant steel factory or a railroad. Just too much capital had to be raised. And so that original vision, that ideal of universal self-employment, just became unrealistic under the Industrial Revolution. And you get a splitting of capitalists and wage workers, okay, and then an underclass, people who are only marginally employed, the desperately poor, the people Marx called the lumpen proletariat. Capital owners at the top then redeployed classical liberal ideas, but now said, these ideas are supporting us, right? The capital interests. Simultaneously, what happened was the rise of total institutions. So even though liberalism is touted as offering freedom to everyone, here I have a beautiful quote from political theorist Isaac Kramnik. While liberals preached independence, freedom, and autonomy in polity and market, they preached order, routine, and subordination in factory, school, poorhouse, and prison. Here Kramnik is talking in particular about liberals who are writing from the late 18th century and over into the 19th century. And I've illustrated here Jeremy Bentham's famous model of the panopticon, which was made very famous by Michel Foucault and his work Discipline and Punish. However, Bentham didn't stop in thinking that this total institution of the prison, whose architectural design he had created, was suitable only for criminals. In fact, he wrote another volume, which I've been reading intensely. The title of this volume, which is not included in Bentham's collected works, is called Pauper Management Improved by Means of the Panopticon Principle. In fact, he argued that the same totalitarian institution used to rigidly discipline prisoners was also a perfect solution for dealing with the poor, including poor children, and that the same architectural model also worked for the insane, for the sick. And in this work, he imagines that inside the panopticon, poor people would present themselves, or if they didn't voluntarily present themselves, he thought that this panopticon institution, which, by the way, would be outsourced to a private for-profit corporation, would be authorized to go out on the streets and kidnap anyone who looked like they lacked the means to support themselves, incorporate them into these prison structures, and then work them. And he projected that this model would be really great for everyone, but especially for the owner of the panopticon, who he had detailed calculations and said, oh, you could get 300% profits from an adult man, 200% profits from an adult woman, but the greatest source of profits of all would come from child labor. Think about that. He spoke of the people incorporated into these panopticons as livestock. Literally, I'm quoting. So, in fact, this is Jeremy Bentham, by the way, his actual body, which is preserved in University College London. That's not his head, that's a wax head. His actual head is in a box underneath his feet. It is reputed, I'm not sure whether this is true, but it is reputed that at meetings of the Board of Regents of University College London, they wheel him out to observe the meetings, and he is recorded as present but not voting. Okay, so Pauper Management Improved, I think, is one of the original sources of the arguments for privatization of public functions. Let for-profit corporations do it. They're way more efficient. They'll relieve the taxpayer of the burdens of paying taxes because these for-profit corporations can just make a lot of money and support themselves that way. The poor and disabled shall be confined. And he had a very vivid imagination how even the extremely disabled could be put to work. So he waxed enthusiastic about making sure that even the sickest person confined to bed could still be given thread to spin and how the feeblest hand could be put to rocking the cribs of the children, the babies in the infant room. The poor would be forced to work in these little panopticons, actually large-scale panopticons, without pay until they paid off the costs of their support. It's hard to reconcile that with the idea that they're making 200% profit. It seems like they're doing a lot more than paying off the costs of their support. He also argued that you could lease the poor out at below market rates to private employers, and then these institutions would take a cut of their wages and huge profits, right? That'll be great. The second pivotal figure of the 19th century, who is the source of contemporary neoliberal ideas, is Thomas Malthus. Today, we think of him as mainly a population theorist whose predictions failed. We think of him as predicting that population would overrun the supply of food and lead to a population crash. In fact, that's a very minor part of his argument. The biggest part of his argument was a critique of the welfare state. And practically every idea criticizing the welfare state today from a conservative perspective was articulated by Thomas Malthus in his Principles of Population. He was a Christian preacher, and what he preached was the Protestant work ethic towards the poor. He said individuals should take responsibility for their own well-being rather than asking other people to support them through the welfare state. He invented the idea of a culture of poverty whereby poor people would become dependent on handouts and then decline into various forms of vice. Excess alcohol consumption, premarital sex, gambling, failure to save, failure to wait to reproduce until one is married and has a stable occupation, and so forth. So we argue that the welfare state was producing perverse incentives for the poor to be idle and engage in vice. He urged that dependence be stigmatized. He also stressed, and this is very important for the political power of the critique of the welfare state, that the undeserving poor are a burden on the deserving middle class. So to undermine the attractiveness of the welfare state, he appealed to the middle class and their sense of resentment that their tax money is going to vicious, idle people beneath them. A fifth element of the 19th century, which is in contrast with classical liberalism of the 17th and 18th centuries, is racial imperialism. You read Adam Smith and Tom Paine, not a drop of racism in these Enlightenment figures. They took for granted the equality of human beings regardless of race. Adam Smith, in particular, has some very strong words about this. The 19th century, though, sees the rise of so-called scientific racism as a practical orthodoxy underwriting imperialist policies across the world of Europe and the United States. So here I'm taking a very late quote from Hastings Rothschild, professor of moral philosophy at Oxford. This is very late because we're already looking at 1924, but similar things were said constantly in the 19th century as well. Rothschild is explaining how utilitarianism can be reconciled with imperialism. And his argument is, probably no one will hesitate to agree that the lower well-being of countless Chinamen or Negroes must be sacrificed, that a higher life may be possible for a much smaller number of white men. So he's making explicit what in fact was the foundational moral premise of imperialism in Europe and the United States. Those are the 5 key elements that I think drove the inversion of liberal ideas, originally in the classical version advanced in favor of workers, now reversed and turned against workers, especially non-white workers. However, in my grand historical narrative here, we have to pay attention to what I'll call the social democratic interlude. Social democracy did have its heyday. We already see in the mid-19th century the rise of labor movements in Europe and the United States, starting to gain a share of wages from the higher productivity brought about by the Industrial Revolution. But social democracy, broadly speaking, didn't really have its heyday until the Great Depression, which led many people to ask hard questions about the viability of capitalism as a system of political economy. And then, of course, from World War I to World War II and afterwards, a dramatic decline of the rentier, that is, of capital owners. So here you could see the declining share, capital share of income in Europe. You can see a crash. The Great Depression really, and World War II destroyed capital share of income. This is all documented by Thomas Piketty in his monumental work, Capital in the 21st Century. So these events discredited laissez-faire liberalism, and of course the wars propelled dramatically increased state activism in the economy. The state took responsibility for the welfare of its citizens, particularly through health care, took responsibility for restoring the economy after the Depression, and also dramatically increased revenues, tax revenues, in order to fund these enormous wars. All of these took an enormous hit on capital share of income and dramatically reduced the power of capital owners in the post-World War II era. Hence, right after World War II, we saw about 30 years of remarkably diffused egalitarian economic growth, where economic growth was widely shared across classes in Europe and the United States. This was also brought about by massive public investment in education, greater openness to immigration, dramatic increased state investments in healthcare, and so forth. What's happened then since the mid-1970s is not a return to classical liberalism, which was all about favoring workers. It's really a return to the 19th century liberal inversion. We can see this first in the economic data. Again, this is borrowing from Thomas Piketty. Basically, you see the capital share of income rising in multiple countries, rich countries. What happened? What made the mid-1970s and 80s an occasion for a return to 19th century ways of thinking? Well, a lot of things were happening during this time. Stagflation. In Europe, you saw state-owned enterprises being seriously mismanaged. And these phenomena discredited Keynesian macroeconomic theory and socialism, understood as state ownership and control of large enterprises. We also saw an ideological counter-revolution in the Mount Pelerin Society, Hayek, Friedman, economists like that. And then, of course, most importantly, in 1989, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe led to the idea that there is no alternative, right? Capitalism, free markets, the only way to go, but this is capitalism and free markets as understood by 19th century thinkers, not as understood by, say, Adam Smith. My claim is that once we see that what's happening today is a return to the 19th century, not really a return to classical liberalism, we're better able to see some of the contradictions embedded in this liberal inversion of arguments that were originally supposed to be supporting workers, targeted against the idle rich, people who are getting all kinds of income, not because they've worked for it, simply because they own stuff. What happens when these liberal ideas are targeted down to workers themselves, who are castigated for being lazy, vicious, and so forth? My argument is that when the target is reversed, we will observe some contradictions in the ideology, because these ideals were originally formulated to be targeted up and not down in the order of social classes. So, for instance, we can see some neoliberal thinkers today stressing the enormous importance of earning one's happiness and not just getting it handed to oneself on a silver platter. This is targeted against the welfare state, against even social insurance like health insurance and Social Security and so forth. But somehow they forget to target this against passive capital income, inherited wealth, shareholder capitalism. Shareholders haven't lifted a finger to produce anything in the firm. They just get the profits. I think that's a contradiction. What about the stress on the importance of individual agency? People standing on their own 2 feet as an individual. Well, that argument is frequently targeted against labor unions. Why should you collect together as workers and make collective demands? But it's never targeted against corporate capital. But what, after all, is a corporation other than a collectivity of capital owners? How come shouldn't they be standing on their own 2 feet as an individual? Why do they get to combine and workers not? What about the stress on the responsibility for the consequences of one's choices? This is typically used to blame debtors for getting into debts they can't pay off. But surely the lenders also have made choices to make those loans, often in full knowledge that the people they loan the money to are unable to pay it off. So before the financial crisis, it was commonplace to offer mortgage loans to people who had no income, no assets, no job. It's impossible to suppose that such individuals would ever be able to pay off their loans. Shouldn't creditors take some individual responsibility for the consequences of those choices? Keep in mind also that creditors already built in to their loan documents a risk premium for anyone considered more risky, so they've already insured themselves against the risk of default. Surely then we should let the defaults proceed. Arguments against monopoly found in classical liberalism against monopoly corporations have frequently been turned against labor unions, but not against, say, the massive extensions of intellectual property law or monopsony employers. And what about those grand incentives that are so supposedly necessary for production? Again, we see a contradiction here. What workers need is sticks. What capital owners need is carrots. But why exactly? I don't see a good argument for that. If anything, capital owners have so much capital, they hardly need any incentive not to spend it, because the richest among us today cannot possibly spend all that money on themselves. Indeed, even in the 1970s, Malcolm Forbes, then one of the richest men in the world, he had billions in today's dollars, he did an experiment. He tried to spend money as quickly as he made it. And so he threw himself a massive birthday party, invited hundreds and hundreds of people, flew them out on chartered jets to his island. He had bands, an open bar, fancy luxury food. He had horsemen. He had hot air balloons. He threw in absolutely every item of luxury consumption he could imagine for hundreds and hundreds of people. He totted up his net worth after this grand, long weekend party and found that he was still richer after spending all this money than he was before. The super rich need no incentives to invest their money, none whatsoever, because they have no other use for it. They can't spend it on themselves. It's impossible. So what has happened to us today? What's happened actually is that we're back to the 19th century, and we can see this visibly. So the left-hand chart here represents Engels' pause. That is, this we can see here, labor compensation in the 19th century. For the first half of the 19th century, it's completely stagnant, even as the Industrial Revolution is propelling growth in productivity. That's the blue line on the left, right? And for the first half of the 19th century, wages are stagnant. That's known as Engels' pause, okay? And look, that's pretty much the same graph as we have here, right? Except inverted. So wages in the second half of the 19th century start increasing at the same slope as productivity in the second half, just as they were in the first half of the 20th century. And then we're basically in Engels' pause now, right, with wages stagnant. It's a return to Engels' pause. And what does that mean for us today? I just want to throw out an idea. I think there has been a reaction to growing inequality, as illustrated here by our return to the first half of the 19th century. And this has had political consequences. The consequences are a move from plutocracy to what I'll call right populism, which is propelled by the class divisions that we saw emerging out of the Industrial Revolution. The difference today is that we see some capital owners, here I've split capitalists into two groups. We could call them establishment right capitalists and populist capitalists. Some capitalists today are redeploying 19th century liberal ideas to authoritarian ends. That's the populist movement. How are they doing this? By pulling Malthus's move of mobilizing resentment of middle-class people against people of color who are misrepresented as idlers living off the welfare state, as threats and dangers and vicious and criminal and so forth, right? They're mobilizing Malthus's idea through a racial lens to generate resentment against underclass and immigrants, and people of color, all supposedly on behalf of the true nation, national wage workers who are represented as the whole people, the only people that matter. I think inequality, rising inequality, lies behind our current populist moment in politics today. It's a product of elite fragmentation, where elites are actually not fully united. The populist story is not just a story of people versus the elites. We're in a right populist moment, both here and in many countries in Europe, where elites are resented because they are supposedly preferring various underclass marginalized groups, people of color, immigrants, and so forth, at the expense of the so-called real people, that is the national dominant groups in Hungary, Poland, Italy, the United States, and so forth. This, I think, is simply a redeployment of 19th century racist targeting of the underclass in today's political terms. So what are our lessons for today? Firstly, it's very important to distinguish the pro-labor 17th and 18th century liberalism, what I'm calling classical liberalism, the liberalism of Paine, of Mill, Locke, and Smith, and Condorcet, from the 19th century plutocratic reversal. Secondly, it's important to understand that this plutocratic reversal of classical liberal ideas is actually contradictory. It's just riddled with contradictions, because those ideas were actually designed to criticize the idle rich and to support labor. And when you reverse that class relation of targets, you get contradictions. This reversal of targeting threatens both democracy and liberal rights, both in conventional plutocracy, what's known as undemocratic liberalism, and its populist forms, which are sometimes called illiberal democracy. But now, is there a genuine return available to classical liberalism, the classical pro-labor liberalism? Here, I think perhaps not. We're in a different era of economics, perhaps at an inflection point, which will lead to the mass replacement of workers by automated robots, artificial intelligence, and so forth. I think it's time for us to accept that technology has created the possibility, the reality, of economies that are absolutely swimming in rents. By rents meaning all kinds of income that are not derived directly from labor. This is our current condition. And hence, perhaps the focus on earned income through labor is inapt in an economy that might face massive artificial intelligence replacing workers in an automated economy. So I suggest perhaps that if liberal democracy has a future, maybe it lies in rents for all. Thank you.
Remember to submit any questions that you want to the on your handout. You will see the address that you can send any questions you have. Let me begin with really a methodological question. It's one you will be very familiar with. You're talking quite a bit about the relationship between certain ideas, political ideas, and the material conditions. And there is an age-old question about what drives what here. Is it the theories of classical liberalism and neoliberalism that actually have produced an effect on the material conditions of production of workers, or are these ideas and theories things that are driven by the material conditions and just superstructure over it?
Right. Oh, I'm a big believer in ideas. And not just because I'm an ideas worker. Material realities do set some important constraints on political and economic possibilities, but they are constraints only. And it's ideas that give us the room to play within those constraints. So in contrast with Marx, who thought everything was driven by just the material substructure. I really favor what John Maynard Keynes said, which is that, I don't have the exact quote, but it's basically the practical man who thinks that he's attending only to material realities and has nothing to do with ideas, in fact, is just driven completely by the ideas of some dead philosopher or economist.
So let me just ask a smaller question of clarification, and that is, what were the changes that to law or policy that made it so difficult to pursue antitrust actions?
Oh, right. So Bork's interpretation of antitrust law claimed that the sole interest of antitrust law was to serve the consumer, not to open up multiple opportunities for multiple entrepreneurs to set up their own businesses, not to protect workers against monopsony. The interests of workers or competing entrepreneurs had nothing to do with it. It was solely a matter of serving customers, and the focus especially was on prices. Okay, so in classical Econ 101 monopoly theory, monopolists increase prices, and that's to the detriment of consumers. And so if you find a monopolist doing that, you can run antitrust against them. However, if you look at contemporary monopoly players like Amazon, like they're driving prices down. Okay, and so they're immune. However, there's reasonable arguments that other interests are at stake, including the interests of workers, of competing businesses, and so forth. And if you look at the origins of antitrust law, these other interests were actually taken seriously, but Bork wrote them out of the equation. So you look at the big high-tech companies, and many services are free, right? So how could you argue with free? But in fact, there are arguments against free.
So here's a question that expresses some skepticism about the story you told about classical liberalism. Was classical liberalism really entirely free of racism? Locke was involved in slavery. Lincoln resisted political equality for African Americans and supported efforts to send blacks to Africa. So is the break between classical liberalism and neoliberalism as dramatic as you suggest?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So let's take Locke first. Here I really recommend, if you want to get into the textual details, to read a wonderful book by Jeremy Waldron called God, Locke, and Equality, which is a strident defense of Locke as a true egalitarian. I think Waldron does an excellent job. It is true that Locke invested in the slave trade and that he participated in the drafting of the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, which provided for a slave code. However, Waldron argues, I think, very effectively that there is not an iota of support for those policies in Locke's own political writings. I think he's exactly right about that. I think Locke was just completely hypocritical. Lincoln is a more interesting case. So Lincoln, definitely anti-slavery, but he was a racist, that's quite right. However, he also evolved, and this is really important. Lincoln learned, and he learned because he was actually engaged in discussions with African Americans, people like Douglas, for instance. And over the course of his career, he was moving. He learned from these discussions. So yes, people in reality, nobody's perfect, but you can see the ideas that they advance. Maybe they don't do them with perfect consistency, but there's no doubt at all, Lincoln, big anti-slavery guy. Maybe he had some extra learning to do, but slavery was the issue of his era, and he was on the right side.
So the defense of Locke is a defense of the theory, but not of the man.
Not the man, that is correct. Right, and human beings, we're riddled with contradictions. Nobody fully lives up to their ideals. We just have to be realistic about that.
So here's a question about the relationship between neoliberalism and classical liberalism. Do you see neoliberalism as an attempt to revitalize classical liberalism, or does it matter what its relationship is to classical liberalism? If we see it as a descendant of it or a version of it, so what do you take the relationship to be, and why does it matter what the relationship is?
One of the things I want to focus on is that there are legacies today of past thinking. And often those legacies are not fully recognized for what they are. Once we do recognize them for what they are, they're open for critical inspection in ways that they weren't before. So if you dress up a set of contemporary practices in the guise of ideals such as of classical liberalism that indeed had very progressive import in their day, you can make these ideas look a lot better than they are. There's all this talk today about freedom, liberty, individualism, self-sufficiency, independence, and so forth. Where are these ideas coming from? The claim is it's coming from these classical liberals who all really believe genuinely in these ideals and had a model for how to realize them. It's the model that we forgot. The model was universal self-employment. Nobody has a boss. Well, that is a credible model of workers being free. Right? If you don't have a boss bossing you around, you are free in the domain of production. That's pretty cool. 19th century had nothing to do with that, except for Mill, special exception. Bentham and Malthus are really where the contemporary moment is coming from. And their ideal was not at all the freedom and independence of the worker. To the contrary, their idea was all these panopticons, disciplining workers, subordinating them in a system that would maximize profits for the capital owners. That's a completely different vision. Now, if that vision were spelled out articulately, how many people would sign on to it? Well, a handful of plutocrats were, but you know, we have votes in this country. Right? Current policies are supported on the basis of ideas that actually cannot rationalize the policies. And that's what I'm trying to expose through this historical investigation.
So I can't resist telling you a quote that I was thinking about through much of your conversation, and I don't know to whom to attribute this quote. It could have been Mark Twain. It sounds a bit like Mark Twain, but it goes something like this. I can't resist thinking that if work were such a fine thing, the rich would have kept more of it to themselves.
No, but here actually is a point of interest in contrast with the lazy aristocrats of the 17th and 18th century who really did pride themselves on their leisure. If you look at the super rich today, they are very, very busy. Virtually all of them are employed, maybe in the financial sector, private equity. These people are making billions and billions of dollars, and they are waking up and going to work. And so they think of themselves, well, I'm working. But my view is there's a difference between work, which adds value, and being very busy. So here's an analogy. If we look at the financialization of the economy and all the bankers making trades all the time, right? Like high frequency trading. Excellent example of people being very busy without adding one drop of value at all. In fact, what's happening is you have independent people who want to make trades, and it's kind of like a giant flow of money, like a waterfall of money. You have the high frequency trader there who's kind of extending his cup and just collecting a lot of the water that's flowing by, right? This is simply extracting value. It's not adding value. And there are hundreds and hundreds, perhaps thousands of business models which are simply based on extracting value. And yes, you have to be busy to extract that value, but it doesn't mean you are adding anything. So by analogy, think of financialization, for the profits from financialization, as akin to the counterfeiter, right? The person who's counterfeiting $20 bills. This person actually might even have a great art to producing these bills. They're really cool, they look genuine. Right? He's really busy manufacturing these bills. They're still worthless. It's all fake, right? He's busy, but he's not adding value.
So I very much appreciated the quote you pulled from Locke's first treatise that people ignore, and I've used that in class many times and found that people don't identify that as being from Locke. Even my colleagues in the profession often don't identify that as being from Locke. Here's a question related to that, though, related to some standard interpretations of Locke. Why doesn't the introduction of money into the Lockean system complicate his views about labor and value?
I think those passages on money are widely misunderstood. So, in fact, over the summer, I've been doing a comprehensive rereading of Locke, down to the tiniest passages. Locke emphasizes the superficial reading of money is that it lets you collect a lot of wealth without having it go to rot. And so you can then justify unequal holdings on the basis of the fact that money doesn't rot, okay? And that's there, but that's not the important thing. The important thing about money is that it enables trade, okay? And we do know that trade, both sides gain, massive increase in value. Locke in particular was interested in international commerce. That's where the big bucks were, right? The Dutch were also very involved. That's how they got rich. You get spices, you know, from Asia. You make a fortune selling them in Europe and so forth. International trade is where huge, huge profits can be made. Locke's point in those passages, actually, is that money enables trade, which makes products worth a lot more because foreigners are willing to pay a lot more for them than locals are. That's how people get rich. But what this means is very important, and Locke says this explicitly in a passage that almost everyone overlooks. He's talking to the landowners in the passages in which he's articulating his argument for the 99% labor theory of value. He's telling the landowners, the value of your land, unimproved by labor, worth almost nothing. What is the source of the value of your land? It isn't just the labor of the person who plows that land. It's also the labor of everybody involved in commerce. The artisans, the people making the ropes for the ship. He enumerates all different classes of workers, most of whom are landless. They're artisans, they're sailors, shipbuilders, and so forth. He's emphasizing that the source of the wealth of the great landowners is the labor of all the workers in the cities, not just the farmers who are leasing that land and farming it. What does one conclude from this? That those landless artisans who are working so hard are producing 99% of England's GDP, but they're not getting that back. They're being ripped off. He doesn't literally draw that conclusion. He relies on the reader to draw it, having laid out the premises. He assumes that the readers are intelligent enough to draw the obvious conclusion.
So I'm now getting vote counts, actually, and I will pay attention to the vote counts as well. So here's a question. Did the proponents of, also a sort of skepticism about the story about classical liberalism, did the proponents of classical liberalism really have every worker in mind when they advocated for labor above capital, or did they have a specific vision of the worker? If only white, non-disabled workers counted, racial imperialism may have been a feature, not a bug, of classical liberalism.
Right, and here I think it's really important to focus on the 17th and 18th century classical liberals. Smith, I think, is the great hero of this story. Smith goes out of his way to condemn the white slaveholders as vicious and to argue that Africans are morally superior to them. He says it quite explicitly. He also insists on the basic equality of talents of all human beings across the world. He explicitly rejects any kind of racial hierarchy. Smith is a real hero about this. Many people of that Enlightenment era, Condorcet too, anti-slavery, anti-racist thinker. Many people of this era explicitly upheld, literally, the equality of human beings and deployed those arguments against imperialism. The Enlightenment was not uniformly pro-imperialist, quite the contrary. They were very critical of imperialism. By the time you get to the 19th century, those Enlightenment assumptions have been cast away. And ironically, it happened in England pretty much at the moment of abolition. So you have this very brief moment of Enlightenment egalitarian thinking about the equality of all human beings across the world that takes a hold of people's imaginations in the late 1700s, in the early 1800s, and they propelled the first wave of abolition, okay, in England and in the northern states of the United States, and also, of course, Latin America. And in England in particular, almost as soon as abolition is achieved in the British Empire, you see the rise of various kinds of racism thinking completely swamping the older egalitarian Enlightenment ideas. It's very ironic, but history is filled with irony.
So labor lies at the center of the story, the classical liberal. And here's a question concerning that and the implications for the social insurance policies. What's the vision of the social insurance policies for classical liberals? Is it a welfare state aimed at assisting people relative to their capacity to work? Or is it a welfare state aimed at assisting people to the same degree irrespective of their capacity to work?
So that's a really great question, because originally social insurance, in the hands of people like Paine and Condorcet, was primarily imagined to be workers' substitute for the lack of capital. So there's a general recognition that every human being at various points in their life, certainly in childhood, but also old age, illness, infirmity, disability, and so forth, needs a source of income other than labor to sustain themselves. Capital owners have capital to take care of themselves. Workers need social insurance. So that's the picture. But then I think maybe what you're suggesting here is that the social insurance model in the contemporary era might not be ideal, because our concept of work itself is very limited. When we think of work, we think of working for a wage in a market economy. There's all kinds of socially necessary labor that is not market labor, that isn't paid. Think of dependent care work, mostly what women do, taking care of children, taking care of elders, taking care of the sick. If they're taking care of family members, they don't get any pay for that. Nevertheless, it's socially necessary labor. People's lives and well-being depend on it. Surely that ought to count. And there's all kinds of other socially important labor of taking care of people that isn't marketized, okay? And so maybe and now in the rise of an economic era where people have difficulty getting full-time hours, maybe in a given week, maybe they can scrape together 20 hours, which is not enough to actually pay the rent and pay for the food bill and utilities and so forth. fluctuating and consistent hours. In Europe, it's very similar. Almost all the new jobs created since the Great Recession are on so-called 0 hours contracts. That means that the employer doesn't promise any specific number of hours. You just sort of on an on-call basis. Temporary contracts that last for 6 months and then they disappear. How can someone cobble together a stable work and plan and have kids if you don't know 6 months hence whether you'll have a job at all? It doesn't enable people to put together a life outside of just scraping subsistence together. So for these reasons, I think we have to reconceptualize the welfare state and not tie access to benefits so tightly to working for a wage. We have to think of ways to support people who aren't working for a wage full time, people who are engaged in unpaid dependent care, labor, and so forth. Because the current system leaves an awful lot of people falling through the cracks.
So a central theme of your talk is the idea that classical liberalism was designed to favor the interests of workers over capital. Are you suggesting that we should understand classical liberal ideas fundamentally as rhetorical interventions rather than as hypotheses about ethics or economics?
Oh, I think they were very much hypotheses about both ethics and economics, but they were also written against background assumptions about how the economy worked. And those assumptions don't really track today's realities. So it's not possible to just go back to the 17th and 18th century. However, the aspirations underneath them, namely the idea that ordinary people count in political economy, not just the rich, that economic and political institutions should be serving everyone, not just property owners. Those are deeply embedded in people like Smith and Locke. And those do endure, but they have to be reconfigured to respond to contemporary economic realities.
So another question in the vein of some skepticism about the classic liberals. Why doesn't Mill's view about liberty not extending to backwards people make him a proponent of racial imperialism?
Now that's an excellent question there. I just have to concede. Mill is a late classical liberal, and he has taken on an awful lot of the perverse 19th century inversion. So that's totally right. I'm not going to defend Mill on that point at all. That's why I think he's not really fully in the classical mode. He's already taken on a lot of water.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was an ill-considered sentence that he put in.
Not just a sentence. Look, he was an imperialist, right? I mean, that was his job.
Yeah, well, right, yeah. Okay. So here's a question I'm not sure I understand, but I'll ask it anyway. What would Lincoln have said about the gig economy?
Now, that's really interesting, right? So many people think, go on Uber, right? The new utopia. And I actually have used Uber and Lyft and talked to the drivers because I want to know, what is it like, and is this good? Is this a good way to make a living? And it turns out that the drivers have very diverse experiences. But lesson number one, most of the drivers, this is just supplementary income. They're not covering all their expenses this way. Occasionally, you can get a very young driver who's 21. And there's something actually wonderful about being in your early 20s. And that is, you can live on almost nothing as long as you can pay the rent. And you can be satisfied with very, very little. As you get older, you've got kids, that's very expensive. And you just need more physical comfort. I'm warning you. I'm there. Okay, I cannot, when I think about the kinds of adventures I had in massively uncomfortable circumstances. Like, I just can't. My body will not put up with it. And so expenses accumulate. But yeah, you're 20-something, maybe you can cover yourself as an Uber driver. But that gets old really fast. Later on, it's really just supplementary.
Here's another one about Locke and money, but a little different angle on it. Isn't it a bit anachronistic to call Locke pro-labor? What Locke says is that men have agreed to disproportionate and unequal possession of the earth by tacit and voluntary consent to the use of money.
So I have a whole paper on this passage. Okay, we have to distinguish two ideas. One is inequality of possession, and the other is scarcity. So Locke says that unilateral appropriation of land in the state of nature is legitimate so long as one leaves enough and is good for others to appropriate. Okay? Once money is introduced, very quickly all the land gets appropriated. Hence, people have violated the criterion to leave enough and is good for others. Those appropriations in the state of nature are not legitimate. Not because they're unequal, but because they leave other people worse off. Okay, that's really important. I think his view is that those appropriations are illegitimate because they leave a large class of people impoverished. Workers now are poor if they don't own land. That is objectionable. How do we solve the illegitimacy of complete appropriation? There's only one way to solve it. We have to get together and create a state. The state can solve this. One way it solves this is by establishing a system of property which, number one, supports the wages of workers, and number two, provides for the poor in that passage I quoted. The only way to organize this is by using state power, because state of nature, people aren't organized. Like you can't, right? You can't get, you can't supply the needs of the poor just through spontaneous individual choices. You need the state to deal with that.
Final question now. Begins with an observation. It's interesting that most of the people today who are repeating the arguments that are in Malthus, as you pointed out, have never heard of Malthus. By what mechanisms has the ideology of Malthus spread from the philosophers to our sort of common?
That's a great question, and the answer is that Malthus wasn't just an economist. He was a Christian preacher. This is what he's telling people from the pulpit. And that ideology spread through religion.
Great. Well, join me in thanking Professor Anderson for a very stimulating